If you just read the headlines, you'd think Germany's armed forces are now bristling with new ships, tanks, and guided systems thanks to a historic defense budget surge. But behind the headlines, the true picture will be judged on budget allocations, the gap between contracts and deliveries, industrial capacity, procurement law reforms, advances in AI and cyber, and actual frontline readiness. Today, we break down exactly what Berlin's rearmament drive has accomplished and what's still stuck in the pipeline, setting the stage for how those early promises from 2022 compare with the concrete realities of 2025. From pledges to purchases. Back in early 2022, Berlin's rhetoric marked a sharp departure from decades of caution. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Chancellor addressed Parliament with a pledge for the largest military investment program in modern German history. The promise was to finally cast off the Bundeswehr's image of empty warehouses, outdated weapons, and painfully slow procurement. 3 years on, that dramatic shift is still a reference point, but converting it into tangible gains has been far from straightforward. The conversation is no longer about whether the intent was genuine. It's about how much of that ambition is now visible in real assets on the ground. The central pillar of this drive was the 100 billion Sondervermögen, a special fund created outside the regular budget to accelerate modernization. At its launch in 2022, the idea was to channel that money into closing the most urgent gaps: air defense, heavy armor, modern combat aircraft, secure communications. Over time, the shopping list has evolved. Early commitments centered on flagship platforms like the F-35 and upgraded Eurofighters, but by 2024, the scope had clearly widened. Secure digital networks, satellite reconnaissance, and ammunition stockpiles entered the priority list, reflecting both lessons from Ukraine's high-tempo fighting and NATO's urging that Germany strengthen less visible but essential capabilities. One clear example came with a multi-year Rheinmetall framework agreement worth roughly $5 billion for 155 shells, signaling a serious push to rebuild munitions reserves and production capacity alongside headline weapons buys. The fund's structure allowed procurement decisions to bypass the slower annual budget process, giving officials room to commit to major programs more quickly. On paper, the results look dramatic. By mid-2025, multi-billion euro contracts had been signed for new Leopard 2A8 main battle tanks, additional naval frigates, helicopter fleet replacements, integrated air defense upgrades, and unmanned systems. Yet the contrast between signed contracts and fielded equipment remains stark. Many projects are still in the earliest production phases, with factories retooling for new armor designs or avionics. Supply chain strains, especially in electronics, have also slowed progress. For now, the Bundeswehr can point to a substantial pipeline of assets ordered, but far fewer are yet operational. One major shift from the immediate post-invasion period is the scale of procurement. In 2022, some early purchases were limited in scope, small numbers of vehicles or quick replacements for aging kit that could be delivered fast. These served mainly as political and strategic signals. Today, orders are on an entirely different level, with contracts covering equipment for full brigades rather than piecemeal upgrades. That means hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles instead of a handful, alongside comprehensive packages for training, sustainment, and spare parts. The approach aims to rebuild coherent, fully equipped formations, not just swap out individual systems. Logistics and lifecycle planning have become more central to how contracts are structured. Previously, acquisition often prioritized the platform itself, leaving support systems underfunded. Recent deals routinely embed long-term service agreements, digital maintenance tracking, and joint NATO training components from the outset. Policymakers argue this is essential to ensure new kit can be deployed and maintained effectively, avoiding the readiness problems that have long plagued the Bundeswehr. Despite that momentum, there are clear obstacles. Some high-profile projects are bogged down in negotiations over detailed specifications. Upgrades to air defense, while urgent on paper, have faced cost increases and delays in integrating with NATO command systems. Naval programs are constrained by limited yard capacity and shortages of skilled shipbuilders after decades of contraction in the sector. Even with contracts secured, delivery timelines often stretch years ahead, creating inevitable lag between political commitment and military utility. Tracking actual deliveries alongside contracts gives a clearer picture. In lighter categories, small arms, light vehicles, certain drones, the interval between signature and handover can be measured in months. In heavier categories like tanks and transport aircraft, the first units are appearing in 2025, but in much smaller numbers than ultimately ordered. For example, some Leopard 2A8 tanks have been handed over for training and exercises, but the bulk of the order remains in production. New aircraft acquisitions are progressing through pilot training and infrastructure preparation, with in-country basing still years away. Within the armed forces, there is a strong awareness that political will and stable funding may not last indefinitely. This has created pressure to move as much of the Sondervermögen into firm contracts or advanced approval as possible. By mid-2025, ministry officials reported that most of the initial, urgent packages were either signed or in accelerated approval, representing many billions of euros in commitments, though scheduled deliveries often extend well into the late 2020s. While contracting heavily front-loads the process, it does not resolve the gap between commitments on paper and operational capability in the field. The progression from small, symbolic orders toward whole unit reconstruction reflects a deeper shift in strategic thinking. The initial steps in 2022 were reactive, meant to respond to immediate geopolitical shock and signal alignment with allies. The current planning is more tightly aligned to NATO's multi-year force readiness cycles, aiming to integrate incoming capabilities directly into joint formations and exercises rather than letting them sit idle. This means designing modernization trajectories that build not just for visible capacity, but for depth, redundancy, and resilience, qualities largely absent in the Bundeswehr's recent history. Still, the long-term sustainability of this procurement drive is far from guaranteed. Defense industry executives note that maintaining current production volumes will require predictable funding streams beyond the lifespan of the Sondervermögen. Firms are adding factory shifts and training new workers to match the surge in orders, but such expansions carry risk if demand falters later. For the government, contracting as much as possible now is a hedge, locking in production commitments while the political environment allows. As 2025 unfolds, the story is one of clear progress paired with persistent lag. Germany has moved from patching individual gaps to attempting comprehensive formation rebuilds, from prestige buys to heavy investment in supporting systems. The project lists and signed contracts convey ambition at a scale unseen since reunification. Yet on bases and in depots, much of that ambition is still embodied in future delivery schedules rather than deployable assets. What is in motion so far demonstrates that Berlin has activated its procurement machinery at an unprecedented pace. The question that follows is whether this accelerated contracting and expanded scope can be sustained within the constraints of its wider defense budget, and how those limits shape the next phase of rearmament. The budget, sir, and its real limits. Against that backdrop of procurement ambitions, Germany's 2025 defense budget sets a new post-Cold War record. Berlin's allocations reached the NATO benchmark, roughly in the mid-euros 80 billions, and around 2.4% of GDP, representing a steep climb from the levels that defined policy before 2022. This allows Germany to claim, at least numerically, that it has met the spending goal NATO allies have been pressing since 2014. It is a notable milestone, but one that could be quickly eroded by shifts in economic output or rising costs, making it less a fixed achievement and more a point of temporary balance. Within that headline figure, the breakdown of spending reveals where Berlin's priorities have shifted. Personnel costs still dominate, reflecting both the scale of the all-volunteer Bundeswehr and the need to attract skilled recruits in a competitive labor market. Pay, pensions, and benefits take a substantial share, supported by upgrades to housing, base infrastructure, and other quality-of-life measures meant to retain experienced operators and technicians. Without those efforts, Germany risks fielding advanced equipment without the trained people to operate and maintain it effectively. Modernization funding has risen faster than at any time in decades. This covers new air, naval, and land systems, alongside upgrades to extend the service life of older platforms and integrate them into joint operations. Much of this category overlaps with the 100 billion Sondervermögen, the special fund created in 2022 to accelerate urgent purchases, capital that is expected to be mostly spent by 2027. Blending its resources with the regular budget allows multi-year programs to stay funded beyond the lifespan of the special fund, a deliberate move to avoid starting projects that would later stall for lack of money. Research and development, though still smaller in absolute terms, has expanded compared to past budgets. The aim is to build domestic capacity in emerging military technologies rather than rely entirely on imports from allies. Funding covers AI-enabled command networks, counter-drone systems, advanced sensors, high-energy laser weapons, and German participation in multinational projects like the Future Combat Air System. The sums here are more modest than those for procurement, but the allocation signals an intent to influence the development of next-generation capabilities. Operational spending has also increased, even if it forms a smaller slice of the overall budget. Conducting large-scale alliance exercises, moving heavy forces across Europe, and maintaining high readiness all require more spending on fuel, transport, training areas, and consumables. Rising energy costs add to this burden, and while efficiency measures are in place, realistic field training remains too vital to cut back. Experience during the pandemic and from the war in Ukraine reinforced how quickly readiness can degrade without constant, credible exercises. One of the most visible shifts in the 2025 plan is the elevation of newer domains to the same strategic level as traditional hardware. Funding for the Cyber and Information Space Command has grown substantially, financing recruitment of IT specialists, hardening of networks against intrusion, and development of complex simulation environments for cyber training. In parallel, space capabilities now have a distinct budget line, covering military satellite communications, space-based Earth observation, and participation in NATO space domain awareness programs. Though these amounts are small compared to land or air forces, the dedicated funding marks a step away from the past practice of folding space-related spending into civilian projects with only marginal military relevance. Unmanned systems, particularly drones, have also gained more attention. The budget supports medium-altitude, long-endurance surveillance platforms, portable tactical drones for smaller units, and trials of unmanned ground and maritime vehicles. Lessons from Ukraine about both the offensive potential and the vulnerabilities of such systems are shaping Germany's approach, with funds also going to counter-drone technology to protect its own forces. All of these allocations operate under the constraints of Germany's constitutional debt brake, which limits federal borrowing. The Sondervermögen was a one-off exemption, created as an extraordinary response to a security crisis. In recent years, the government has also adjusted fiscal rules to permit certain defense-related borrowing or exemptions, an important change that makes it easier to structure multi-year procurement contracts without breaching the cap. Even so, defense spending competes directly with priorities like healthcare, pensions, and climate initiatives, and relaxing the brake further would require political deals that are never guaranteed. These fiscal limits influence not only what programs are funded, but also the pace at which they progress. To stay within legal constraints, contracts are often designed with long payment schedules, spreading costs across several years. This reduces immediate budget spikes, but can slow the arrival of urgently needed systems. Available industrial capacity, already stretched by increased orders, further restricts how fast spending can translate into deliveries. The debt brake also shapes the rhythm of defense investment. Sustaining the 2.4% of GDP figure depends on both economic growth and political will. A slowdown could force cuts or difficult trade-offs, while rapid GDP growth might lower the ratio unless defense budgets rise in step. For planners, the current level is less a permanent baseline than a political commitment that must be renewed every budget cycle. Even within the expanded resources of 2025, the Bundeswehr has to make choices. Not every desired program can run at once, and prioritizing cyber, space, and unmanned systems has meant deferring upgrades to some traditional capabilities, like transport aircraft or large-scale munitions stockpiles. These trade-offs play out in parliamentary budget committees, where each service branch argues its case and negotiates against the fiscal ceiling. Meeting NATO's spending target carries diplomatic weight, especially after years of criticism, and the 2025 budget gives Berlin a tangible rebuttal to those doubts. But the figure sits close to the threshold, and sustaining it will require both continued political consensus and disciplined financial management. Much of the current increase has been made possible by one-time measures and special accounting treatments, tools that may not be available indefinitely. If the Sondervermögen winds down without replacement, Berlin will face the harder task of funding long-term commitments entirely from the regular budget. For now, reaching 2.4% of GDP provides clear political cover abroad and a stronger position in alliance planning. The larger question is whether this is the beginning of a stable new spending era or the peak of an exceptional cycle driven by immediate geopolitical pressures. However durable the headline figure proves, the structure of the budget reflects a deliberate attempt to align resources with the capabilities the Bundeswehr wants to field in the next decade. That alignment on paper does not guarantee timely results. Turning allocations into operational systems depends on how effectively the procurement system can move programs from approval to delivery, something that, in Germany's case, has long been one of the weakest links. Cutting through Berlin's procurement gridlock. For years, procurement in Germany was notorious within NATO for its protracted timelines and bureaucratic drag. Approval to buy a major system could be granted, budget secured, and yet years might pass before manufacturing even began. Multiple layers of legal review, sequential rather than parallel decision-making, and an appeals process that automatically froze work whenever a losing bidder challenged a contract kept projects moving at a glacial pace. Environmental assessments for even modest upgrades could stretch site preparation by many months. The cumulative effect was simple. Costs mounted, requirements shifted, and by the time deliveries arrived, the kit was often no longer cutting edge. The German government's 2024-2025 answer to this was to legislate a structural shake-up. The centerpiece is the Planning and Procurement Acceleration Act, the BWPBBG, which broadens and builds on emergency measures passed in 2022 to cover all Bundeswehr procurement. It was explicitly designed to chip away at entrenched bottlenecks. Among its concrete provisions, the suspensive effect of specific contract award appeals has been removed for defined defense programs, meaning work can begin while certain disputes are still being decided. New environmental exemptions apply to much of the defense infrastructure pipeline, and ministries can now make structured advance payments to contractors meeting early milestones, allowing production capacity expansion before final designs are locked. The Act also raises mandatory tender thresholds and suspends the practice of splitting orders into multiple lots for separate bidding until 2030, a step aimed at cutting duplication and shortening timelines. In practical terms, this aims to let German forces sign and fund projects faster, but industry still must deliver. The thinking in Berlin is that compressing the approval phase reduces dead time before factories can tool up, while giving industry early cash helps head off capacity shortfalls later. Where previously a new vehicle program might have faced sequential legal, fiscal, and environmental gates, the revised framework allows many of those to run in parallel, with lower risk decisions delegated to project teams rather than routed through multiple ministries. The late-stage legislative debate underscored that this isn't a full bypass of oversight. Provisions remain for independent audit of cost and performance, as well as legal recourse in cases of alleged irregularity. What the BWPBBG changes is the automatic freezing effect of those challenges. Instead of pausing an entire program for months while a court hears a procurement protest, production can progress under conditional safeguards. The government is betting that, under current threat conditions, the risk of modest procedural missteps is outweighed by the strategic cost of inaction. To illustrate the gap these reforms seek to close, consider the old baseline rather than specific contested examples. Heavy equipment acquisitions could take close to 3 years from initial requirement definition to contract signature, without counting the manufacturing phase. Smaller, commercial off-the-shelf buys, such as adapted civilian drones, might still spend upward of 12 months in evaluation and certification before units could train with them. These glacial timelines sat increasingly at odds with NATO readiness goals. Under the BWPBBG, processing times for clearly defined urgent requirements are now mandated to be significantly shorter, with pre-qualified suppliers eligible for direct award in certain categories. This applies not only to large prime contractors, but also to smaller firms and startups. One rationale for allowing advance payments early in the cycle is to encourage less established companies with promising technology, such as counter-drone systems or AI-driven surveillance platforms, to enter the defense market without absorbing prohibitive sunk costs before revenue starts. Streamlining also extends to the environmental clearance stage. Before the Act, a warehouse expansion for armored vehicle maintenance or an assembly hall retrofit for naval systems could require an exhaustive environmental impact assessment, pushing back the start of work well into the following budget year. Now, defined categories linked to Bundeswehr operational output can follow a simplified review, reducing pre-construction lag without removing environmental considerations entirely. For projects judged urgent to security, that difference can mean a workforce starting site work in months rather than after a year-long paper process. Critics point out that even the fastest contracting mechanism cannot conjure extra shipyard slots, skilled welders, or specialized machine tools overnight. Naval builds are still hemmed in by limited maritime infrastructure, and multinational programs, such as next-generation combat aircraft, move at the pace their slowest partner permits. The Act addresses the administrative piece of the puzzle, not the physical realities of industrial output or coordination with allies. Within the Bundeswehr's planning staff, however, the change is tangible. Officers handling requirements can now engage potential suppliers while still refining specifications, giving industry an early picture of likely contract terms and delivery expectations. That in turn allows firms to line up supply chains and workforce ahead of signature. While such lead time does not collapse the multi-year production phase, it can shorten gaps between commitment and first delivery, particularly for systems already in some form of production. Supporters in Parliament stress that prioritization is also evolving. With certain categories of projects now able to progress rapidly, services are resequencing their submissions so that quick-turn items climb the queue. These might be communications upgrades, modular shelters, or light armored vehicles, deliverables that can appear on the ground within the same parliamentary term, maintaining momentum for reform. Longer, more complex programs are still being initiated, but their political utility in proving the acceleration might be limited until after 2030. Legal analysts note that the suspension of mandatory lot splitting until that date could draw challenges from smaller firms that traditionally bid on subcontracts rather than entire platforms. The government's counter-argument is that consolidation in the tendering phase speeds negotiation and removes interfaces between multiple suppliers, each of which could otherwise become a bottleneck. Whether this drives efficiency without curbing competition is likely to be tested in court over the coming years. Defense Ministry officials caution that early signs of improvement should be read carefully. The first generation of projects under the BWPBBG is still unfolding, and the actual production bottlenecks will be most visible once these accelerated contracts transition to the manufacturing floor. The appetite for rapid awards has to be matched by the ability of industry to scale, a point repeatedly raised in technical briefings to committees approving multi-year funds. In the meantime, NATO partners are watching. German delays have long been factored into alliance planning and multinational readiness exercises. Trimming those timelines even modestly could alter force generation models and the credibility of pledged capabilities in contingency scenarios. If Berlin demonstrates it can sustain such changes over successive budget cycles, it would mark a break from patterns entrenched for decades. Whether acceleration translates into real operational gains will come down not to parliamentary votes or legal clauses, but to the pace at which ordered hardware emerges from assembly lines, passes trials, and reaches deployed units. That question, how much Germany's defense sector can produce and how quickly, remains central. What's rolling off the assembly lines? The current surge in procurement inevitably raises the question of what is actually making it out of factories and into Bundeswehr service. By 2025, the picture is mixed. Production lines are running at levels not seen in decades, with major orders in the system, yet the pace of handovers remains measured rather than explosive. In heavy armor, the Leopard series remains central. Germany now fields fewer than 300 main battle tanks in total, after decades of drawdowns. Recent procurement cycles, including a headline order in 2024 for hundreds of additional Leopards, have pushed assembly at Rheinmetall's Unterlüß and Kassel facilities into sustained high gear. The company is running a dual track, modernizing existing Leopard 2s already in service and building new Leopard 2A8s from scratch. Refits are entering units more quickly, while completely new builds are paced more slowly as the lines ramp towards higher volume. This approach puts upgraded firepower into the field sooner, even if the larger surge in numbers will take years to materialize. Infantry fighting vehicles follow a similar pattern. Large orders for the Puma have combined with reliability fixes to earlier batches, with Bavarian lines alternating between upgrades and fresh production. That mix has kept output steady, though not yet at the volumes implied by total contract numbers. Industry teams cite the complexity of integrating new electronics and protection systems as a brake on immediate scaling, but expect throughput to grow as these configurations stabilize. In artillery, production of the PZH-2000 self-propelled howitzer, restricted for years to upgrade work, has restarted in earnest to replace units sent to Ukraine and expand the domestic fleet. Parallel investment is going into the newer, lighter RCH-155 wheeled system. Initial handovers have restarted the flow into German service, yet component choke points, like barrels and fire control units, still constrain speed. Competing export commitments add to the pressure on suppliers. Airfleet modernization is underway, but weighted toward the future. German pilots and ground crews are already in F-35 training abroad, with home basing infrastructure scheduled for completion in the coming years. Eurofighter orders have been topped up, with a small number incorporated this year, largely to replace retired airframes. Helicopter procurement has been somewhat quicker to show results, with additional NH-90 transports and smaller H-145 MS entering service for utility and special forces roles, though in modest numbers compared to longer-term plans. Naval construction has progressed in visible but deliberate stages. Steel is being cut for the first F-126 frigates at expanded yard space in Kiel, and additional K-130 corvettes are joining the fleet for Baltic operations. Submarine programs advance on timelines stretching well beyond the current decade. Here, even with full order books, finite slipway capacity, specialist labor constraints, and integration cycles mean first-of-class ships are years from commissioning. Wider industrial picture is one of significant growth under strain. Rheinmetall and other major contractors have expanded assembly capacity with new halls, longer shifts, and automation upgrades, while their order books and share prices have surged, valuations in some cases doubling or tripling compared to pre-2022 levels. Hiring is up across the sector, but the need for welders, machinists, systems engineers, and electronics technicians regularly outstrips supply. Shipbuilders like ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems have invested in faster combat systems integration and modernized fitting out areas, but naval work remains inherently lengthy. Smaller manufacturers have also been pulled into the rearmament effort. Firms supplying optics, communication systems, vehicle armor modules, and logistic truck cabins have increased output, some opening new plants. In Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia, drone assembly sites have been launched to meet growing orders for unmanned aerial systems. Despite this uptick, many of the high-end electronic components feeding these systems still rely on imports, keeping the supply chain exposed to external disruption. Comparing contract volumes to deliveries makes the gap plain. Orders secured between 2022 and 2024 run into hundreds of combat vehicles, dozens of artillery units, expanded air fleets, and multiple major naval builds, representing many billions in commitments. By late 2025, only a minority of these have reached operational units. The remainder sit on production floors, await subcontracted parts, or are still completing trials. Some delivery schedules are deliberate, aligned with crew training pipelines and base modernizations, but many reflect the time it takes to rebuild capacity after decades of contraction. The mismatch between political announcements and the slower rhythm of physical delivery has a political cost. Opponents of the government's approach argue that deterrence depends on ready, deployable assets, not contracts. Proponents counter that the acceleration from the pre-2022 baseline is unmistakable, and that sustained funding will close the fielding gap over the medium term. Defense officials emphasize that limitations are now more about industrial throughput than budget ceilings, with capacity expansions seen as the key lever. Internal planning cycles suggest some guarded optimism. Units slated for major new systems in the next 2 to 3 years are already adjusting training and logistics to accommodate them, betting on timely arrival. The trajectory of 2025 shows both the benefits of reactivated lines and the truth that a hollowed-out production base cannot be rebuilt overnight. By year's end, the proportion of contracted hardware actually in Bundeswehr hands provides both evidence of progress and a measure of the remaining distance to the stated force goals. Achieving those goals will require not just domestic production advances, but careful coordination with suppliers, subcontractors, and partners across Europe, a dimension of the build-up that extends beyond what German industry can do alone. Europe's factory floor, Berlin's defense partnerships. By 2025, Berlin's elevated defense profile has reordered its position in Europe's military-industrial landscape. Now the European Union's largest defense spender, Germany is no longer just a major market, but an active force in shaping cooperative projects across the continent. For decades, Paris and London drove most of the high-profile joint ventures, while Berlin often kept a lower profile, preferring to join established initiatives rather than initiate them. Record spending and a procurement list that spans heavy armor to space systems now put Germany at the center of multiple flagship programs as both customer and co-developer. The Eurodrone program reflects this shift. Conceived as a French-led effort to give Europe its own medium-altitude, long-endurance drone, it was delayed repeatedly by disagreements over design specifications and cost distribution. In recent years, Germany has met its full funding share and pushed its domestic industry to align with joint standards, moving the project towards production, but still within a contested development phase. In 2025, final assembly of German airframes is split between Airbus defense and space sites in Bavaria and partner facilities abroad. Berlin has argued for higher payload capacity and upgraded sensors to ensure the aircraft remains competitive into the 2030s, even as timelines remain extended. the Main Ground Combat System, MGCS, intended to replace Leopard 2s and French Leclercs with a modular, AI-assisted platform, remains in development and slowed by workshare disputes. German and French contractors continue to negotiate over leadership on components such as the main gun and active protection suite. This year, Berlin committed additional funding and agreed to incorporate certain French-led subsystems without secondary tendering, hoping to streamline progress. The move departs from earlier insistence on strict workshare parity, a stance that, while protecting industrial interests, had at times delayed decisions. Similar tensions mark the Future Combat Air System, FCAS, aimed at producing a next-generation fighter integrated with drones and secure digital networks. With advanced stealth, propulsion, and sensors at stake, long-standing disputes over work responsibilities and intellectual property remain unresolved. Germany has increased its financial contribution and secured a broader role for its aerospace firms in areas like mission systems and cloud-based combat networks. But reporting in 2025 still describes the program as politically sensitive and under pressure to avoid breakdown. Outside these long-range projects, Berlin is deepening shorter-term industrial cooperation. Shell production stands out. The war in Ukraine and unprecedented ammunition expenditure have driven joint ventures with Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic to produce 155 artillery, tank ammunition, and guided rockets. German capital has funded new production halls in Silesia for shell casings, which then move through plants in Germany and the Czech Republic for filling and final assembly. These arrangements sustain Eastern European output while tapping German manufacturing experience and quality controls. By dispersing production sites, the partners aim to reduce single points of failure and build resilience if facilities face disruption. This approach has strengthened political links as well as supply chains. For NATO's Eastern members, it offers leverage over German procurement priorities and a tangible connection to Berlin's rearmament. For Germany, it ties defense commitments to the security of frontline states, broadening the political coalition behind its military build-up beyond its traditional Franco-German axis. Berlin's industrial partnerships are not confined to European partners. The 2025 Memorandum of Understanding between Lockheed Martin and Rheinmetall to explore a European rocket and missile production center underlines Germany's openness to transatlantic cooperation. This prospective facility, aimed at producing key munitions domestically for both national and allied inventories, signals an intent to diversify sources of advanced precision weaponry while embedding US technology within Europe's manufacturing base. Even with this diversity in partnerships, frictions are common. National security rules can hinder the exchange of sensitive software or encryption systems, making firms wary of granting access that might jeopardize export controls. Partners, in turn, express concern about becoming dependent on a single supplier for critical subsystems. Such issues seldom halt projects outright, but slow them enough to frustrate planners who see inventories fall behind targets. Germany's enlarged budget has subtly shifted leverage in these arrangements. In past decades, France's leadership in cooperative projects often meant stronger influence over specifications. In 2025, Berlin's larger order volumes give it greater weight in setting requirements and delivery schedules. Some partners welcome this as a guarantee of sustained demand. Others fear national industries may be squeezed if too much work is drawn inside German borders. Calls within Germany to channel more production domestically to reinforce its own industrial capacity have added to this unease. Despite the politics, there are tangible successes. One is the joint German-Polish AI-enabled targeting system entering early trials this year. Developed with German funding for software integration and Polish production of hardened hardware, it is engineered for both crewed combat vehicles and remote weapon stations. Capable of identifying and prioritizing targets in real time and feeding that data into command networks, the system has demonstrated faster engagement times in Bundeswehr tests, and is expected to boost the responsiveness of Polish mechanized units as well. The project shows the operational benefits of combining advanced German R&D with partner manufacturing capacity. These examples illustrate how Berlin is blending high-value technology inputs with geographically distributed production. That mix meets urgent capability gaps, distributes economic benefit, and roots political goodwill among allies whose security concerns are shaped by proximity to potential conflict. It also reflects a pragmatic recognition that timely outputs often come from smaller, targeted projects, while larger flagships work through their political and technical stalemates. By mid-decade, Germany's partnerships span the spectrum. Long-term ambitions like FCAS and MGCS, medium-term projects such as Eurodrone, short-cycle munitions production with Eastern allies, and transatlantic industrial linkages through ventures like the Lockheed Rheinmetall initiative. Each comes with its own constraints, but cumulatively they show Berlin operating as anchor customer, joint developer, and when necessary, hard bargaining competitor in Europe's defense economy. The extent to which these alliances improve NATO's collective capabilities will depend on whether agreed workshares translate into timely delivery and genuine interoperability. In high-technology areas, especially, political will have to be matched by investment in the research organizations and specialist workforces that can deliver next-generation tools before they are overtaken by external threats. That sets the stage for Berlin's next challenge, deciding how much of its expanded resources should go into emerging domains that could define operational advantage in the coming years. AI, cyber, and the next battlefield. Within this broader rearmament drive, Berlin has identified advanced software, data integration, and network security as areas where it can shape future battlefields rather than just match existing capabilities. Artificial intelligence and cyber operations now sit at the center of German defense planning. The stated intention is to design future command structures so that AI is not an add-on, but an organizing principle, fusing sensor data, assessing threats, and allocating resources at speeds human staff work cannot match on its own. Planning benchmarks describe AI-enabled command networks operating at brigade and joint task force level, linking land, air, naval, and cyber forces within a shared data environment. This aligns with a wider European trend. The cybersecurity market across the continent has grown rapidly in recent years, and Berlin's government has significantly increased spending to strengthen both defensive and offensive capabilities in the digital domain. Germany has also channeled funding into programs such as the Defense Innovation Accelerator, known nationally as Palladian, and participating in NATO's Diana framework, which are designed to connect defense needs with startups and research labs capable of moving ideas into deployable systems faster than traditional procurement cycles allow. The 2025 Accelerator portfolio offers a window into these priorities. One strand focuses on autonomous ground vehicles, from small remotely operated resupply units to heavier unmanned platforms trialed for reconnaissance and limited direct fire missions. Development work is centered on control systems that allow semi-independent movement, with vehicles interpreting terrain and avoiding obstacles without constant operator input, while keeping key decisions, such as weapon release, in human hands. Another stream addresses counter-drone systems. The Bundeswehr has followed closely how small, inexpensive drones have been used in large numbers for surveillance and attack in recent conflicts. Current prototypes integrate radar, electro-optical sensors, and radio frequency jamming into portable, tripod-mounted units suitable for front-line deployment. AI routines help classify airborne contacts and reduce false positives by distinguishing between civilian and military types, with targeting data passed directly to nearby troops or vehicles. AI-enhanced surveillance is a parallel investment. Here, the focus is not on collecting more data, but on interpreting it more effectively. Algorithms provided by German industry are tuned to detect patterns in video feeds, radar returns, and intercepted signals that might indicate hostile activity. Instead of human analysts combing through hours of material, the software flags anomalies, irregular heat signatures, vehicles in unexpected locations, electronic emissions inconsistent with civilian activity, and passes them to human reviewers, cutting detection times in situations where minutes matter. Cybersecurity has grown into its own operational sphere. The Bundeswehr's cyber and information space command continues to expand, bolstered in 2025 by a new intake of civilian-trained specialists with backgrounds in network forensics, malware analysis, and the defense of industrial control systems. Funding has gone into creating hardened, redundant network architecture designed to keep command systems functioning under persistent attack. Dedicated simulation ranges, isolated from the public internet, allow units to rehearse defensive and offensive cyber operations against networks modeled on real-world targets. These cyber units are being integrated into broader operational planning. In major exercises, they are tasked with actions such as disrupting enemy logistics software during simulated conventional offensives or blinding radar ahead of notional airstrikes. Resourcing covers personnel, bespoke intrusion and defense tools, and hunt-forward systems aimed at detecting vulnerabilities in peacetime before they are exploited, mirroring NATO's emphasis on multi-domain coordination. Some of the accelerator's efforts fall into early-stage or speculative territory. One such concept, flagged in public innovation summaries, envisions swarms of miniature air or ground robots carrying sensors to detect chemical, biological, or radiological signs in the environment. The design aims for rapid mapping of contamination or tracing the source of hazardous material, with AI tools compiling patterns across large sample sets. These remain trial projects rather than near-term operational acquisitions, but illustrate the breadth of exploration underway. Part of the accelerator's model is to bring smaller firms and research institutions into the defense ecosystem. Projects are given short development timelines and clear performance targets. Those meeting objectives move into testing with Bundeswehr units, while underperforming efforts are dropped. For a system long dominated by lengthy, risk-averse programs, this represents a significant cultural shift, trading some certainty for speed and adaptability. The integration push has extended beyond research to training events. In 2025, Germany ran a large-scale, classified NATO exercise simulating cyber conflict with a capable state-tier opponent. The scenario required defending national military networks, disrupting an adversary's command systems, and coordinating these cyber actions alongside conventional simulated operations. Official assessments shared within the alliance described improved defensive performance and faster decision cycles compared to previous years, with observers noting progress in integrating cyber teams into joint force structures. The comparison with physical rearmament is straightforward. In both cases, the test is how quickly investment and procurement translate into usable capability. In software-driven domains, the development cycles can be shorter, but so is the window before a system risks obsolescence. Berlin's approach emphasizes modularity, keeping autonomous vehicle software, surveillance algorithms, or cyber toolkits flexible so they can be updated without full program restarts. There are political and strategic questions attached. Embedding AI deeply in core command functions increases reliance on software, with all the security risks that brings. Expanding offensive cyber capability can raise sensitivities within NATO when rules of use and technology sharing come into play. Managing transparency while protecting operational methods is likely to remain a challenge, particularly for projects involving multiple national stakeholders. Even with such caveats, mid-2025 marks a shift from concepts on paper to capabilities in use and in training. Germany's innovation pipelines foster work on autonomous platforms, counter-drone assets, advanced surveillance processing, and niche sensor systems. The cyber force is larger, better resourced, and embedded in combined arms planning. Evaluations from major exercises point to a stronger defensive posture than in prior years. In Berlin's evolving force mix, AI and cyber tools are now counted alongside ships, aircraft, and heavy armor as core instruments of national and alliance power. But the most sophisticated systems, no matter how well integrated, still need skilled operators, maintainers, and commanders to turn potential into performance. The people problem. Modernizing the German armed forces is not only a matter of factories, contracts, and new technology, it also hinges on the people who make a force usable in the first place. In 2025, the Bundeswehr is confronting a personnel gap that cuts across every service branch, constraining how quickly new capabilities can be fielded and sustained. Berlin's long-term plan sets a target of reaching around 203,000 active duty personnel by 2031, but current reporting puts the actual figure at roughly 181,000. The gap is not confined to the active roster. In reserve forces, Berlin has aimed for 35,000 to 40,000 trained individuals able to reinforce deployments or replace frontline losses. Current ready reserves are thought to sit in the mid-20,000. On paper, these shortfalls might look manageable, but at unit level, they translate into undersized crews, maintenance teams stretched thin, and an operational model that shuffles the same personnel between roles to cover shortages. That in turn disrupts training cycles and delays the moment when new equipment can become fully operational. Competition for qualified recruits is a central difficulty. Germany's strong civilian economy, and in particular its technical, engineering, and information technology sectors, offers higher wages, greater flexibility, and more stable working hours than the military. A skilled machinist, avionics technician, or cyber specialist will find abundant opportunities outside the barracks, with none of the location changes, deployments, or physical demands of service life. The same scarcity applies to IT and cybersecurity specialists, whose expertise is equally sought after by commercial firms from Frankfurt to Munich. Retention compounds the problem. Many soldiers and technicians depart after their first term, taking their training and certifications into civilian roles. The military must then invest in building up replacements from scratch. For leadership positions, the losses are particularly costly. Replacing an experienced non-commissioned officer or a technical officer means losing years of embedded expertise and team cohesion. To address recruitment and retention, the government has introduced a range of measures grounded in documented policy. Infrastructure investment has increased, with the 2025 budget expanding funding for barracks renovation, new accommodation blocks, and modernized base facilities in North Rhine-Westphalia, Bavaria, and Schleswig-Holstein. Improved living conditions are intended to support longer postings and reduce family disruption from frequent relocations. Defense officials have repeatedly linked these upgrades to retention, particularly for mid-career personnel, weighing the trade-offs between service life and family stability. Pay and benefits around deployments have also been adjusted. Additional allowances for longer tour, targeted tax exemptions, and more predictable rotation schedules have been rolled out to reduce attrition connected to overseas service. For some missions, pre-deployment support packages now include childcare subsidies, assistance with home management during absence, and funding for limited family travel to deployment sites when conditions allow. Recruitment campaigns themselves have adapted in tone and focus. Instead of leaning primarily on appeals to duty, the messaging highlights tangible benefits, vocational qualifications, internationally recognized certifications, and pathways into civilian industries in demand of similar skills. For prospective cyber recruits, the cell includes exposure to secure operational environments and advanced systems not widely available in the private sector. For engineers and mechanics, it is advanced training on diagnostics, weapons integration, and high-performance platforms, skills applicable in sectors beyond defense. Policy discussions have also moved into more controversial territory. Volunteer military service schemes have been expanded, offering short-term enlistments to test suitability for longer careers. Alongside this, political debate over some form of conscription has re-emerged. driven by concerns that demographic constraints will otherwise make the 2031 personnel targets unattainable. While no decision on compulsory service has been made, the discussion reflects a shared recognition that voluntary recruitment alone may fall short. Education partnerships form another plank in the recruitment strategy. The Bundeswehr has expanded programs placing recruiters and serving personnel into technical schools, vocational colleges, and universities, aiming to identify potential candidates early. Incentives range from stipends to partial tuition coverage in return for service commitments. Joint research ventures in fields like materials science, robotics, and AI applications serve both to advance military capability and to create pathways for specialized talent into the forces. Even with these efforts, the strain on unit manning remains. Deliveries of upgraded armor or new aircraft sometimes outpace the training and assignment of full crews. Experienced operators are retasked to fill gaps in priority formations, leaving other units short-staffed. Accelerating the training pipeline carries risks, particularly in complex specializations like aviation maintenance or advanced cyber defense, where full proficiency takes years to build. The demographic challenge deepens the difficulty. Germany's workforce is aging, and incoming cohorts are smaller than those retiring. By the time eligibility standards are applied, covering health, fitness, and skill requirements, the pool shrinks further. The Bundeswehr has responded by relaxing some entry prerequisites in certain technical and support roles, offering training from scratch to candidates with aptitude but no formal qualifications. The trade-off is additional time and cost before recruits can contribute at an operational level. Officials describe recruitment patterns in 2025 as showing modest improvement compared to recent years. Gains are uneven. The Army has benefited from interest in operating new armor, drones, and other modern systems. The Air Force remains constrained by the long lead time for pilot certification and technical training. The Navy faces steep competition from civilian maritime industries, offering higher pay and more predictable schedules. Interestingly, specialist cyber units report rising application rates, lending some support to the argument that targeted technical recruiting can bear fruit when paired with modern facilities and clear career incentives. Underlying all of this is an acceptance within the Defense Ministry that the success of rearmament is inseparable from the human factor. Infrastructure upgrades, adjusted benefits, volunteer service options, and even debates over conscription all point to the same conclusion. Without a stable flow of trained personnel, Berlin's investment in modern equipment will never translate into proportional combat power. The recruitment and retention picture in 2025 contains some positive signals, but also exposes the limits of attracting and holding talent in a competitive labor market. How these human resource gaps intersect with the broader question of military effectiveness is already feeding into a separate but related debate, one focused not on headcounts alone, but on how much of the existing force is in a state to carry out the missions it might be assigned. Readiness ratings versus reality. Assessing the strength of a modern military means looking beyond how much equipment it owns to how much of that force could actually deploy and sustain operations if called upon. That is the focus of NATO's regular readiness evaluations, and in 2025, those assessments give Germany a more sobering, operationally relevant measure of its progress than procurement totals or press releases can provide. The Bundeswehr has more capable hardware now than it did 3 years ago, but those gains have translated unevenly into real combat power across the services. Readiness, as NATO defines it, is about fielding complete units, personnel, equipment, and logistical support on specific timelines and sustaining them over the course of high-tempo operations. Since 2022, Germany has moved upward in these assessments, with a notable increase in formations able to meet deployment criteria. Yet the overall ratings still sit below the alliance's desired benchmarks for sustaining high-intensity operations. The causes are consistent: maintenance backlogs, spare parts shortages, and manpower gaps continue to limit how much of the force can be considered fully ready at any one time. The clearest improvements since the rearmament push began are in heavy armor. Modernized Leopard 2 tanks and Puma infantry fighting vehicles have replaced or upgraded older platforms that spent months, and in some cases years, waiting for repairs. Ammunition stocks for live fire exercises are healthier, allowing for more complete training cycles. NATO evaluators now see a greater proportion of armored battalions able to mobilize with full crews and operational vehicles. But even here, there are underlying constraints. Some formations meet readiness standards only by temporarily pooling equipment from other battalions. That can satisfy an inspection requirement, but would quickly break down in simultaneous deployments or extended campaigns. Air Force readiness shows a more mixed pattern. Eurofighter Typhoon availability has improved thanks to better spare parts supply and maintenance contracts that integrate industry teams on base, boosting flying hours and keeping more aircraft mission capable. Pilot proficiency rates are also higher than in 2022. However, the aging Tornado strike aircraft remain a weak link, with some squadrons still dependent on cannibalizing airframes for parts to meet sortie targets. The move to the F-35 will eventually replace them, but those jets are not yet operational in 2025. As a result, overall Air Force readiness is holding steady and improving slowly, without the sharper gains seen in the Army. The Navy's readiness profile reflects the long timelines involved in shipbuilding and overhauls. Newer corvettes and frigates benefit from high availability, but older ships approaching retirement spend long periods in dockyard maintenance, reducing ready-to-deploy numbers. Submarine readiness is particularly limited. Mechanical downtime and a shortage of qualified crews mean only a fraction can be put to sea at once. NATO reviews note that the ships and crews available integrate effectively into Allied fleets, but the small pool of deployable hulls leaves little flexibility for maintaining presence in multiple theaters. Assessments also take into account how units perform in large-scale exercises designed to mimic operational conditions. NATO drills in 2025 have shown that German units can move faster to reinforce Allied positions compared to a few years ago, helped by better pre-deployment preparation and more reliable vehicles. One such exercise in Lithuania illustrated the trend. An armored brigade arrived more quickly and with fewer mechanical issues than in previous comparable events. But once in the field, the same formation struggled to keep all vehicles operational without stretching maintenance crews and scavenging minor parts from non-critical equipment. These workarounds can keep a unit in the fight for the short duration of an exercise, but they would place sustained operations at risk. Air components in these scenarios have demonstrated better early sortie generation, supported by forward-based munitions and on-site maintenance teams. Even so, unexpected failures, such as a critical sensor or radar unit going down, can still ground an aircraft longer than acceptable in a real conflict. Replacement parts for some systems remain scarce enough that delays are measured in days, not hours, underscoring fragile supply chains. The naval side tells a similar story. When tasked with rapid multi-ship operations, Germany's newer surface combatants tend to perform well, while older vessels or submarines may have to withdraw for repairs that cannot be carried out at sea. With such low redundancy in the submarine fleet, the loss of a single hull during a mission reduces coverage and impacts NATO's evaluation of sustained readiness in the maritime domain. These examples point to a common set of constraints. Modern kit only counts toward readiness if supported by robust maintenance capacity and steady supplies of parts. Recent reforms have trimmed the time it takes to order and receive spares, but stockpiles for many high-demand components remain thin, in part because funds and production slots have been committed to new acquisitions. Under NATO's measurement system, even a small set of missing critical items renders whole platforms non-available, cutting into a formation's score. Personnel depth is the other decisive variable. A tank or aircraft may be serviceable, but without a complete, trained crew, it does not count as fully mission capable. Some army units have been able to equip themselves before they are able to staff all positions, leaving them technically short-handed. Air Force squadrons sometimes fill immediate needs by assigning training or staff pilots to operational roles, a short-term fix that cannot be repeated indefinitely. Navy ships with partial crews can sail for transit or training, but will not meet NATO's criteria for fully ready combat operations. The linkages with broader rearmament themes are clear. Gaps in skilled personnel, already a concern in recruitment and retention planning, directly depress readiness. Industrial bottlenecks that slow repairs or spare parts flow have the same effect. The structural reforms in procurement and spending have pushed Germany toward higher potential readiness, but that potential is still capped by the supporting systems that keep weapons and units operating at full strength. Against this backdrop, NATO's qualitative assessments for 2025 mark real improvement since 2022. More German formations are able to deploy without extensive last-minute fixes, and frontline capabilities in key areas, especially armor, show clear gains. Yet the persistent distance from alliance targets means planners still classify Germany as a force in transition rather than a fully reliable contributor for prolonged high-intensity missions. What that means in practice is a force with more teeth than before, but not yet able to sustain maximum bite across multiple fronts for as long as NATO's strategic scenarios might demand. For German policymakers, bridging this gap carries operational and political weight. Achieving parity with NATO's most consistently ready forces would strengthen Berlin's influence in shaping alliance posture and give it greater credibility in both deterrence and crisis response. Remaining short of that bar risks reinforcing the perception that Germany's military power is considerable on paper, but constrained in practice by the same support and staffing issues that have lingered for decades. That tension, visible in inspection reports, exercises, and deployment rosters, defines the next challenge of the rearmament effort. The question is how these readiness realities will shape the Bundeswehr's ability to meet its forward commitments, sustain allied operations, and answer rapid deployment calls where time and resilience matter as much as raw capability. The Eastern Front factor. By 2025, Germany's role on NATO's northeastern flank has shifted from supporting actor to a central pillar in alliance contingency planning. The driver remains the same threat that jolted NATO into acceleration 3 years ago: Russia. While Moscow's operational tempo has changed since the early phase of the Ukraine war, less emphasis on sweeping ground offensives, more on consolidating occupied territory and rotating units along the Western Military District, the potential for rapid, limited offensives keeps pressure on the alliance's eastern flank. Nowhere is that pressure more acute than in the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are geographically exposed, with narrow approaches and little strategic depth. Their defense plans assume that larger NATO members must reinforce them within days to prevent any hostile advance from becoming entrenched. Germany's location and scale make it the natural anchor for such operations. In this environment, Germany has increased its permanent forward brigade commitments in Lithuania, including sizable armored elements. This is built on the existing NATO enhanced forward presence framework, which Berlin has led for several years. What was once a battle group is now structured as a brigade-level presence, with a rotation system refined to be more than a symbolic deployment. Pre-deployment training is tailored to Baltic conditions and scenarios, and large combined arms exercises have become routine. German-led units increasingly operate with their own armor and support vehicles during rotations, rather than relying heavily on pre-positioned NATO stock. This shift, while logistically demanding, allows crews to fight with the exact equipment they train on at home and signals political commitment through the investment in moving and maintaining heavy kit forward. Baltic defense planning now integrates German capabilities more directly. Contingency plans assign Berlin defined timelines, routes, and reinforcement responsibilities for operations into Latvia and Estonia, as well as Lithuania. German staff officers work within NATO's regional defense cells in the Baltics, participating in detailed planning that links German units' movement across Poland with access to pre-positioned equipment. These plans are aligned with NATO's ongoing emphasis on pre-positioning and military mobility projects to shorten reinforcement timelines. Investments that include hardened depots, upgraded railheads, and improved road networks capable of supporting heavy armor transit. On the ground, this has resulted in secure storage sites in Lithuania and northeastern Poland, holding German armored vehicles, heavy trucks, ammunition, and engineering assets. Facilities are hardened against attack and connected to NATO's logistics command, enabling assigned German units to draw gear rapidly upon arrival. Locations are chosen for their access to resilient rail and road corridors in case air routes are disrupted. The operational concept is simple. Personnel can be flown or driven forward while equipment is already in theater, cutting deployment time from potentially weeks to days. To make this reliable, Berlin has funded regular rapid reinforcement drills. In these exercises, troops are alerted with short notice, move into Poland and Lithuania, collect pre-positioned vehicles, and join maneuvers almost immediately. These tests go beyond travel speeds. They probe the chain of communications, the precision of logistical transfers, and the ability to integrate seamlessly with allied forces already deployed. Some exercises are deliberately unannounced to units beforehand, simulating the uncertainty of a crisis alert. The process has underscored the importance of maintaining forward-stored gear to high standards. Vehicles and systems in storage require regular servicing, software updates, and spare parts aligned with those in home units. German maintenance teams rotate forward to conduct inspections before the equipment is released for use. Without this sustained upkeep, pre-positioned stock can lose the very readiness advantage it is meant to provide. Still, the current forward posture exposes limits that Berlin has yet to resolve fully. Industrial expansion in recent years has been aimed in part at supporting such deployments, but output is still ramping up. The Bundeswehr does not yet have the surplus to fully equip home formations and maintain complete forward rotations without compromises. Sending a battalion's worth of armor and vehicles to Lithuania means those assets are absent from their home station, affecting training for units left behind. Industrial growth is a necessary component of solving this, but remains a maturing effort rather than a complete fix. Manpower depth also constrains flexibility. Current force levels allow Germany to meet its NATO eastern flank commitments, but the margin is narrow. Sustaining those operations while responding to a separate crisis, whether in another European theater or outside the continent, would require difficult trade-offs. NATO contingency concepts often assume Germany will lead one main operational sector, rather than spreading forces more thinly across multiple commitments. Ammunition and sustainment needs are a further concern. Certain munitions, especially precision types and key artillery calibers, still face production bottlenecks due to component shortages and competing orders. A high-intensity campaign in the Baltics could consume stockpiles quickly. To mitigate this, Germany has linked parts of its joint production ventures with Poland, Slovakia, and other Eastern European allies to forward deployments, with output earmarked for Baltic-focused reserves. This approach strengthens both political and logistical ties, but does not eliminate the lead times inherent in expanding mass production. NATO's 2025 strategic review describes Germany's eastern flank performance as credible but stretched. Forces are arriving on time, integrating well in multinational environments, and operating modernized equipment in the field. That is the credible element. The stretched element comes from how much effort is required to make that happen and the risk that sustained or expanded commitments could expose gaps elsewhere in the Bundeswehr's posture. For NATO, and especially for the Baltic allies, even a stretched but dependable Germany marks a sharp improvement over the situation before 2022, when questions about speed, equipment, and political will loomed larger. From Berlin's view, its role on the eastern flank reinforces its claim to be NATO's central European anchor. The commitment carries costs, fuel bills for heavy equipment moves, higher operational tempo for personnel, and the opportunity cost of dedicating assets to one theater at the expense of flexibility elsewhere. Yet so long as Russia retains the capability and intent to contest Baltic security, NATO planning will continue to rely on Germany to hold this line. The NATO review's dual-edged verdict, solid performance within existing limits, speaks to a broader reality. In forward defense, credibility is measured not just by what is on station, but by how much can be sustained if conditions deteriorate. Germany has closed some of the gaps in speed, integration, and equipment quality that once undermined confidence. The test now is whether it can add the extra depth through manpower gains, industrial maturity, and logistical resilience to handle the unexpected without undermining what is already committed. Those strategic assessments form part of a larger debate taking place in Berlin and allied capitals alike. Policymakers and military planners weigh the visible improvements in forward defense against the unresolved vulnerabilities underlying them. How those gaps are perceived will influence not only operational planning, but public expectations at home and abroad. Is Europe any safer? Seen from mid-2025, the question of whether Europe is actually safer has no simple answer. The view varies depending on where you stand, but most agree the balance has shifted in important ways. Polling in Germany shows majority support for higher defense spending and significantly more acceptance of the Bundeswehr's expanded role than before 2022. A sizable minority remains skeptical about whether budgets on paper will translate into sustained capability and readiness. In France and Poland, perceptions lean more positive, especially among those working directly in NATO cooperation, while in the Baltic states, the reassurances come from the visual reality of German armor on their soil during exercises. For those publics, confidence is linked less to budget announcements and more to how fast reinforcements could arrive in a crisis. Connecting shifts in public sentiment to the underlying facts reveals the core of the issue. Germany is meeting NATO's spending guideline. Readiness indicators are climbing from the lowest points of the past decade, and modern equipment is flowing into service. Those are clear advances. But deterrence depends not just on improvement, but on whether an adversary believes NATO could impose unacceptable costs across the whole span of a conflict. For commanders, that calculation hinges on what Germany can field immediately, replace when losses occur, and keep in the line for months under pressure. Faster deployments to Lithuania and other forward positions have tightened the alliance's opening posture. Yet industrial bottlenecks and manpower shortages still call into question how deep that readiness runs if fighting drags on. Among security analysts, two main readings of these changes have taken shape. One, reflected in think tank commentary and in NATO planning, sees the 2022-2025 period as a structural turning point. They point to the 100 billion Sondervermögen, major shifts in the lender-level support network, and procurement law reforms that have cut through administrative delays. In their view, Germany has broken from its incremental past, choosing to re-equip whole formations rather than make token purchases. Even if many systems are still in production, the scale and permanence of these reforms make the deterrence posture more credible than at any point since the Cold War. The other side, including assessments from research institutes like Bruegel and the Kiel Institute, warns that comparisons to Germany's own recent baseline can be misleading. They note that Russia retains large reserves of artillery, armor, and munitions, even after losses in Ukraine, and that in a heavy conflict scenario NATO would need production rates that Europe's current defense industry has yet to achieve. German industry has expanded, but not yet to the sustained output levels required for prolonged, simultaneous commitments on the eastern flank and beyond. Here the concern is not just with what can be mobilized quickly, but with the staying power needed for months of high-intensity operations. In practical deterrence terms, that distinction matters. NATO no longer plans for a long warning period before potential conflict. Instead, it assumes compressed timelines and immediate pressure. Quick mobilization is vital, but it is only part of what keeps an adversary deterred. A lasting defense requires supply chains that can withstand disruption, industrial capacity that can replace equipment faster than it is consumed, and political consensus to keep resources flowing, even when domestic budgets are under strain. Germany's economic weight and central geography make it pivotal in this equation, and equally vulnerable to overload if commitments outpace available reserves. One tangible risk is industrial overstretch. Rheinmetall, ThyssenKrupp, and others have expanded plants and workforces on the back of firm government orders, but those expansions are tied to continued political will. Should fiscal priorities shift or export restrictions limit supplementary demand, production could scale back as rapidly as it's scaled up. Analysts argue that the current window should be used to build and stockpile munitions, spares, and critical subsystems, while manufacturing capacity is warm, to avoid capability gaps later. Alliance politics complicate the picture further. Most NATO states are currently near or above the 2% spending line in response to Russia's posture, but history shows how quickly such alignment can fray in calmer periods. Different threat perceptions, immediate danger in the East versus competing priorities in the West and South, can slow decisions on resource allocation. As a framework nation in multiple alliance structures, Germany will face pressure to maintain or even expand forward commitments at the same time as domestic actors question the costs of sustaining them. Political will is therefore as central to long-term security as budget totals or industrial output. The drivers behind Berlin's acceleration, Russia's war, allied pressure, public tolerance for higher defense spending, remain in place for now. But elections, economic downturns, or the return of other domestic policy demands could alter that balance quickly. Without reinforcement from stable, long-term policy, capability gains risk plateauing. On the ground, the signs are undeniable. Faster force movements into the Baltics, higher operational availability of core platforms, expanded domestic arms production, and new technologies moving from concept into field use. The vulnerabilities are just as visible. Recruiting shortfalls that slow unit formation, maintenance and parts supply chains that still lag ambitions, and a production base that needs steady orders to stay at its current tempo. That mixed picture feeds into how allied capitals view the trajectory. Baltic leaders welcome the concrete deployments, but push for faster delivery of promised capabilities. Southern European states value the sharpened collective defense posture, while watching for any diversion of resources from their theaters. The United States continues to urge Berlin to convert fiscal strength into a greater share of deployable combat units. Inside Germany, the argument turns on whether the current pace can be kept up long enough to embed change, or whether 2025 will mark a peak that fades without a sustained push. Supporters of the present policy note that advances over the last 3 years have been greater than in the preceding 2 decades combined. Critics stress that without a multi-year plan to lock in readiness, industrial output, and manpower growth, Europe's security gains could prove temporary. The Bruegel and Kiel reports give weight to that caution, highlighting the gap between current production increases and the demands of large-scale, high-attrition warfare. Has Berlin made Europe safer? The short answer is that there has been clear and significant progress, but sustaining industrial output, growing the trained force, and building resilient stockpiles will determine whether that safety is durable. The transformation is visible. Its permanence is not yet guaranteed. That leaves allies and adversaries alike tracking the same measures. Whether Germany can keep money flowing to its defense sector, keep production lines active without interruption, and turn that output into units that are staffed, trained, equipped, and able to remain in the field. Those outcomes will define the impact of this rearmament phase and will frame the next stage of debate over what comes next in Europe's security landscape. In 2025, Germany has moved from signaling intent to fielding a force with more modern equipment, quicker procurement cycles, and forward deployments that matter in NATO planning. Yet manpower gaps, constrained industrial output, and limits in sustained readiness show the work is unfinished. One gauge to watch in 2026 will be whether Berlin sustains above 2% core defense spending without relying solely on one-off funds, and whether major programs shift from contracts to visible delivery ramp-ups. Germany has moved from signal to substance, but the real measure will be whether this momentum becomes institutionalized. More factories, more people, more sustained readiness, not just a brief procurement surge.